O'r were bolio a clia, a eris y bwyld yn yr octus, si ion wysle sy gwyni cor ar ffod. O ffyr cynochas ar y marwg dron i herin, fe'n sian nacht cyn y seron i croga a lach partin ar i amacnid is y siediog. On shiel as y dos arnia splocus a cymora is y ciliura. Lord Mayor, distinguished members of the Oireachtas Minister, distinguished guests, I am absolutely delighted as President of Ireland to be here this evening to commemorate all those brave citizens who played a part in the 1916 Rising and thus were part of the founding moments from which our independence and our present state flowed. May I commence by thanking the many descendants and relatives of the participants in the 1916 Rising who have gathered here today to honour their brave ancestors. Firkin Fáilte Roimh Galéir, all of you here this evening share and represent at a unique and personal level the significance of the actions taken by those with whom you have a relationship. And thus, while this occasion is one of pride in citizenship for you, it is, I do realise, also one of family and intimacy. Yours is a special relationship with the founding moments of our state and with the creation of the independent Ireland that we now enjoy. And I am privileged and proud as President of Ireland to share this event with you. Some of you are present are related to the leaders of the Rising, now immortalised in the history books not only of Ireland but elsewhere as the signatories of the proclamation or as leaders of the participating organisations. Others among you represent the many quiet, unsung heroes and heroines who moved around the streets of Dublin on that seismic Easter Monday and in the days that followed. Names like Lily Kempson, Walter Bear, James Maguire, Daniel Brophy, Margaret Quinn and Patrick English, and many more. They may not have been perpetuated in the names of streets or buildings, or even in songs, poems, and films of the period, but they and so many others of every rank and skill played their own unique, brave, and significant role on the streets and in the buildings and in the alleys of Dublin during that April week, a week that would change Ireland's history forever. Whatever the valued memory or connection, whatever the valued memory or connection that has brought you here, all of you in this room share a direct link to the people who, some with more preparation than others, took to the streets of Dublin on Easter Monday 1916 to make a demand for independence and call for an end to empire and to make a response to the consequences of imperialism. Those who participated were men and women who risked everything in their different ways by occupying main buildings in the city, by moving ammunition around its street, dodging snipers in order to carry messages or transport food and medical supplies to where they were needed, and undertaking the many other essential tasks in a city fighting for freedom and inspired by the declaration of a republic. For all of us citizens today, theirs are stories of great bravery, vision and determination. But they were also, for their loved ones' independence, stories tinged with sadness, loss and separation. That human price paid should not ever be forgotten, and it should remind us today of the great debt of gratitude we owe to all of those who bravely risked their lives 100 years ago so that future generations of Ireland could grow up as citizens of a free and independent state. Those sacrifices by your forebears are for all Irish citizens a source of inspiration and patriotic pride. But they are for you, in addition, personal stories of family experience, choices that were made that had special meaning, and consequences too for your families. Across a distance of time, there is the danger that we might lose the human essence of the lives of the women and men who changed the course of our history, or perhaps at a distance, be inclined to interpret their actions solely through the prism of competing accounts of major political or constitutional change. Tonight, we have an opportunity to give correct place to the intimate human dimension of the Easter Rising and the sacrifices made by so many of those who helped us to build our nation. Is iad san na cúman cohiachs as a hacan, or veidirachti di new, agus or veidirachti gan choran don tauki. And sacrifices there were. I often think of Lily Connolly's words to her husband James when she and her daughter Nora visited him on the eve of his execution. But your beautiful life, James, cuirean úrlárach de guivnadam, on builagus ni hibertiag lach ni firis na maná, páiseach san éirí amach ar a hém. Ní ráidir cinse faoin hara bheachar an éirí amach, agus ní ráidir ag súla marachtáil fiú, chun an tuiris sin eáil is é sin a séir. Your presence calls to mind the risks and sacrifices of the women and men who became involved in the rising. They may have been uncertain of its outcome, and without expectation of living to see what could subsequently be achieved in the name of Irish freedom. So this gathering of the descendants of those who took part in demanding and seeking to establish our freedom is a gathering of those families who grew up with the memory and lingering sense of a lost loved one. An occasion such as this, then, gives us the opportunity to shine a light on an oft-forgotten chapter in the story of 1916 and the War of Independence. I refer to the layers of grief and loss and the final farewells that had to be borne that cast long shadows across families for so many years. We are all, and I, in preparing this speech this evening, are indebted to those historians and the families who share their experience, their work together making possible this new and necessary understanding. For example, when we remember Thomas MacDonagh, we should not just recall his role as commandant taking control of Jacob's biscuit factory, but we should remember him as a young man and father whose daughter woke up and put her arms around his neck as he said his last goodbye to her on Easter Sunday night. Patrick Pearse's final words to his mother before he was executed: "I will call to you in my heart at the last moment." These are words that for many will echo as strongly across the years as the memory of his reading of the proclamation in front of the GPO at 4 minutes past noon on Easter Monday afternoon. Má smuoine mi dátha, mar aithreacha agus mar drothóracha, mar inianacha agus mar lianam, mar inianam the nocht. Tá sé níos éasca ar an dhiiscin óil ar a séalta raibh an éirí amach agus le linn an éirí amach féin. As we think of them then as fathers and mothers, daughters and lovers, as we do tonight, it allows us to place ourselves more easily in their lives and to appreciate the experiences they lived through in the lead up to and through the Rising. The key actors in the Rising were not abstract or mythical figures. They were living and particularly conscious and engaged men and women. They were poets, academics, journalists and civil servants, city clerks and shopkeepers, rural farmers and labourers, Catholics and Protestants, whose voices made the call for a new and reimagined Ireland. And when we read the first-hand accounts that have been made available to us now, and particularly in recent scholarship, we are presented with a real sense of what it was like to live in Dublin in the early 20th century. That period, between 1910 and 1920, now known as the Revolutionary Decade, was a vibrant episode in Irish history. Far from any imagined homogeneous and insular Ireland with which some would present us, the Ireland of that time was a hotbed of creativity, with articulated demands for civic participation, a time of passionate public discourse, and it was also an Ireland that was deeply divided in terms of class. The teeming tenements in the abandoned Georgian areas of the inner city were locations of the worst poverty in the empire, whose capital was less than half a day's travel away. 5,000 tenements were home to 87,000 people, comprising 26,000 families. Of those families, 20,000 lived in the space of just one room. In the suburbs, the previous occupants of George and Dublin, many of them landlords, charging rents that would secure a small house in Britain, in the words of Patrick Pearse, prepared for summer tennis. In rural Ireland, consolidation of landholding was underway, and a grazier class was seeking political influence, and indeed succeeding in terms of politics, credit, and commerce. So today we view the Rising as being synonymous with republicanism, but that, of course, was not a dominant ideology at the time. Even if it was understood, and yes, it was understood and deliberately included in the proclamation by Patrick Pearse and James Connolly, who were very well aware of its historical and contemporary significance, and particularly of its emancipatory promise. Some of those, of course, who sought independence in this decade, we should remember, were seeking an Irish freedom that could have facilitated the expansion of commerce within an empire as easily as within a republic. Even amongst the ranks of some of those of the Irish volunteers, whose rhetoric was republican in tone, many were honestly motivated by a desire to counter the unionist threat to home rule, and their concern too might have been to secure their recent and invaluable gains in terms of security of land tenure, holdings that had been achieved against a backdrop of insecurity, poverty, and involuntary immigration. Then too, of course, some of the rebels recorded their surprise when they learned that a republic had in fact been declared in the proclamation. The signatories understood the spirit and meaning of what was a republic, in the sense of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the American Revolution. But the loss of Patrick Pearse and James Connolly by execution would be all the greater because they had brought an egalitarian, workers' rights emphasis into the citizen-army volunteer relationship, whose coming together is reflected in the language of the proclamation. Their loss would become all the more evident in the years that followed, with the difficulties from the IRB that would obstruct the drafting of the democratic programme of the First Dáil in 1919, the minimalised language of the 1922 Constitution, which could not carry the language of Pearse and Connolly, and indeed, their loss would lead to the deep institutional conservatism of the early decades of the state. The Ireland of the early 20th century was a complex place, where the shops and the restaurants and back rooms of radical Dublin were alive with the conversations of a dynamic mixture of feminists, socialists, radicals, nationalists, anti-imperialists, and the many other ideologists, compelled in their different ways to dream of a new and better Ireland. And as I read of their accounts, what is striking is how they cared for each other. They were able to, and it is most impressive, to differ with dignity and respect for each other's views. Constance Markovic would ask her sister, Eva Go Booth, to visit Agnes Mallon because she had a house of children and would need help. And Eva would in turn write to Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who, while a pacifist, still brought provisions to those who were involved in the insurrection. So some of you today may be related to the nationalist families who socialised in the church halls and pub rooms around Clanbrassil Street and Harold's Cross. Others to the middle-class radicals, pacifists, suffragettes and feminists, such as the Sheehy Skeffingtons I have mentioned. Others to the cultural radicals, such as the MacDonaghs and the Pearces, who lived in the neighbouring suburbs of Rathmines, Rathgard and Ranelagh. Others of you may be related to figures such as the cultural and artistic literati who clustered around Harcourt Terrace, such as Uncreeveen, Douglas, the Heather or Sarah Purser, who had language and cultural rights as their priorities, and which were key to the vibrant Irish revival which they had sought to build and which inspired so much of the idealism that is at the heart of 1916. All of the participants in 1916 had come to perceive and recoil from what was a constant theme in the assumptions of the imperialist mind, that those dominated in any colony, such as Ireland, were lesser in human terms, in language, culture, and politics. The historical evidence for this view was all around, in housing, hunger, immigration, exclusion, and language loss. The cultural freedom allowed was a freedom to imitate and ingratiate. Our road to independence stretched too, of course, beyond the capital city. And thus, let us not forget revolutionaries such as the Waterford Quaker Rosamond Jacob, or the Cork journalist Liam the Rushta, or Maria Carney from Belfast, friend and confidant of James Connolly, amongst the many other activists across the country who became involved in their different ways in building towards, participating in that foundational moment of our national history that is 1916. And for the younger generation of that time, that latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th, there was the heady experience of the emergence of a great generational divide. Some young revolutionaries were coming from and continuing a strong family Fenian tradition that included parliamentarism, which many had indeed many successes in land reform and in the seizing of appropriate opportunities for making the case for home rule. But for others, such as the younger Giffords, the Plunketts and the McSweeneys, this was too slow, and thus they were rejecting the constitutionalism of their elders in favour of the necessary revolution as they saw it, and the seeking of a war of liberation. Even within individual families, loyalties were often divided in a deeper sense. For example, Eamon Khan's brother William was fighting with the British Army in France, while Eamon fought against them in Ireland. In both cases, they had expectations most profoundly and ethically and honestly held for what was for them the promise and the realization of a better Ireland, an Ireland of freedom. It is critical then to our understanding of the Rising that we view it in that wider context, and even in the wider historical context of the First World War. This was, after all, together with the lockout of 1913, an important pretext to the Rising. By the early 20th century, a pinnacle of imperialist expectation and arrogance had been reached, and the unassailability of the great European empires, assured a century earlier at Vienna, was now under attack and was crumbling. The Boer War had been widely viewed in Ireland as an anti-imperial struggle, while the First World War and its rhetoric reinforced a perception that imperialism was drawing its final breath. After all, 6 empires entered that war, only 2 would emerge. The world was in a turmoil of expectation of forms of independence, and as Maurice Walsh put it in his recent Bitter Freedom, why would Ireland have been different? According to the Czech leader Tomáš Masaryk, The war had turned Europe into a laboratory atop a graveyard. Ireland's rebellion then has a global significance, acting as it did as an inspiration for independent movements around the world through the 20th century, particularly in other British colonies. As Dr. Colin Malvar, for example, has noted, Vivi Giri, who would become the 4th president of India between 1969 and 74, came under suspicion here in Dublin as a young Indian law student where he was studying, and as he claims himself, a deportation order was served on him. And culture was a central element of the rising, and it was an inspiration for those who took part. In the years leading up to Easter 1916, the Irish had become an increasingly literate people, giving rise to an extensive readership of newspapers, which allowed an alternative culture to emerge in the shape of provocative and radical journalism. Journalists that included Bulmer Hobson, Helena Maloney, Arthur Griffith, and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington contributed polemical work to publications such as Young Ireland and United Irishman. Such papers, of course, were frequently banned by the British authorities. To borrow, if I may, from the title of Diarmaid Ferrette's recent book, the cultural leaders of the revolution were simply concerned not just with military or political victory, but with the elevation of the Irish people, long considered a rabble to the status of a nation. The Irish literary revival was, of course, part of a profoundly progressive movement. The founding of the Land League, of course, the Gaelic Leisure Association, the Gaelic League, generations of Irish men and women had sought through such organisations to simultaneously retrieve their heritage and fashion an alternative Ireland. The Irish Geist at the Sauliacht Command. Myriad and intertwined connections existed between all of these cultural groups and at both executive and grassroots levels. And as I said, they frequently differed, but they differed with dignity and tolerance and respect. And it was such mutual affiliations that created the networks of the emerging political movement that would lead us into Easter 1916. And the breadth of the intellectual work is truly astounding. The intellectual work that was combined with activism. James Connolly could write a play, be familiar with George Bernard Shaw's or Ibsen's work, while at the same time being busy with the tasks of organisation and agitation. Francis Sheehy Skeffington would write for several papers. The Timpla Cultura Harvis Severan, again. Lily W.B. Yeats, Jack Yeats, James Joyce, George Russell agus Shauna Cahasig. Alien Tori agus Swinter a Bayat, a vi flaholas a vi chimanta, the sail and fob. Narshunaha poblactic, social effeminig agus either Narshunaha, a Bayat fair agus manon, agus yastaguha, Erin new a rata cockacrohu. Erin a miakan shan stars and shan cultor, libra anti. Is Erin a miak the dini sayer can a younger fein a usod gach law. William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats, Jack Yeats, James Joyce, George Russell, Sean Casey. The richness of the cultural milieu of the time is stunning. Artists and thinkers, public intellectuals and engaged radicals who are generous and committed to the life of the public and the life of the community. Nationalists, Republicans, socialists, feminists, internationalists. Great women and men of the period typically lived many of these roles and, as I have said, treated each other when they differed with the greatest of dignity and intellectual debate. They dreamed of creating something new and radical in Ireland, something which would be continuous with a distinct Irish culture and history, in which people would have self-respect and the confidence to use their own language on a daily basis. And all of these strands of the rising, they are present in the proclamation, which offers us a generous and social political vision, one that can still inspire us today. We should never forget that it was addressed to the nation's women as well as men in equal terms. This was 2 years before women over 30 were allowed to vote, and some more years before Constance Markovic would argue for that extension of the vote from women below 30 to 21. I think it called forth a republic, the proclamation, that would guarantee, I quote, religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens. On that matter, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington was fulsome in her praise of James Connolly for including the equality of women, regarding it as she did as the first, as a real first, an emancipatory document drafted by men that put women's equality as a first principle. Of course, during the passage from those moments of the proclamation to the 1930s, that egalitarian emphasis would weaken. Women would have to struggle for their equality, and in that they would invoke regularly the most direct connections with the women of 1916. And that inheritance they invoked particularly in the debate on Bunrock na hÉireann in 1937. Our nation has journeyed many miles from the shell-shocked and burning Dublin of 1916. We can see that in many respects we have not fully achieved the dreams and ideals for which our forebears gave so much. A democracy is always and must always be a work in progress of a commitment to deepening democracy. And how we use the independence we have been gifted will continue to challenge us, as it does today, morally and ethically. We must ensure that our journey into the future is a collective one together, one in which the homeless, the migrant, the disadvantaged, the marginalized, and each and every citizen can find homes. That they are all fellow travelers on our journey together. Our journey together, which will include all the multitude of voices that together speak of and for a new Ireland born out of contemporary imagination and challenges undertaken. So this evening, let us look to our past in a way that is emancipatory and transformative. Let us recognize all that was powerfully suggestive in that past as we set about now constructing the foundations of a new and better Ireland. Let us remember with respect not only those who have called us here today, or those leaders whose names are indelibly etched into the history books of Ireland and the world, but also all those who lost their lives during the 1916 Rising. Let us remember the sung and unsung heroes and heroines of 1916, those who fought for Ireland and those caught up in the events on the streets of Dublin. Let us remember all those who died or were injured in Dublin, the majority of whom were civilians. Of the 485 people who died, over half were civilians, and 40 of those were children aged 16 and under. Children forgotten for so long, but in recent years reclaimed by the work of Joe Duffy and others. We reflect and recall the loss suffered by all families. We recall and respect all the families who lost sons, fathers, brothers, sisters or daughters. Agus mar facat scir cami dhehan, gwyl sydd y dwlgus arinne fod public a hawlw, agus a crow, agus a cyrra Greek, as a miag na bonahori brodwl. Nasiwn croga, le fish agus le sprit fial denocta. Today we are all charged to take on our own responsibilities in imagining and building a republic in the fullest sense, institutional and one that will be experienced as a republic, one of which our founders would be proud, truly representative of a nation rooted in courage, founded in vision and a profound spirit of generous humanity. Garamila Mahaki Sperbana.